I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces. Happy Friday morning to all of you, and hope this is going to be the thing that launches you into a wonderful and exciting weekend. So consider this like pre-party, like we're going to have a good time. I will say this: this morning's town hall is it's kind of your standard town hall, except for the fact that the panel consists of me. So we're going to be more in conversation this morning. We have a town hall coming up in May, which is going to be a panelist town hall. So we've got a couple of town halls that, of course, will be in the spring OLLI session. But for this morning, in terms of the theme of We the People, I've got some points I want to make. And rather than the usual format of me giving a lecture for like 90% of the time and then seeing if there's time left for questions, this is actually quite different. This is me giving some opening remarks, and while I'm giving opening remarks, not only can you respond to the opening remarks or ask any questions you'd like to, if there is anything that you'd like to ask about that relates to the idea of we the people, law and order, constitutional law, the Supreme Court, if there's anything you want to put on the agenda, please put it in the chat section so that, and I will leave plenty of time today, because like I said, this is more of a conversation interaction than it is me giving a lecture. So feel free to add that in, and I'm happy to kind of join the conversation and add whatever insights I can. So let me just go ahead and switch over to my slides. And what I'll do is give some opening remarks, kind of give you an idea of what I'm getting at when I talk about, we the people, what's really going on here. So, so one of the ways, one of the questions I ask in terms of, what has been changing in the last few years? It feels like things have certainly changed a lot, starting with perhaps November 2016, but even before that a bit. And part of me always goes back to these two pictures, which is, how do we get from the 1960s, where free speech was the thing we fought for? Also note for the fact that, everyone's wearing a suit, to the right, where we get people, burning the same free speech signs. So I those of you that have been in classes with me over the last, in the fall term and also this term, know that I have this ongoing question of just, how do we get from point A to point B, and what does this mean in terms of, the fabric of the US? And so I'm going to go through a few things of concern I'd like to share with all of you. And like I said, if you have things you'd like to add or things you'd like me to address in more detail, please put them in the chat section. First thing I would like to bring up is the First Amendment, which is very much undergoing a certain amount of stress and challenge, both in the court system, but also in the sense of the way society is responding to free speech itself. To remind all of you, there are two parts to the First Amendment. One deals with freedom of expression, which includes, of course, free speech, but also includes freedom of assembly and also the right to petition government for redress of grievance. But it also, and I think it's interesting, we often forget this, the First Amendment starts out, remember, the First Amendment is first because it was considered the most important, and it has this element of religious liberty to it. So religious liberty and free speech were seen originally as kind of part and parcel of the most important thing that we need to protect. Now, in terms of social changes we are in the midst of, and if it feels like we're in the middle of a lot of social change, things like that feel kind of new, like people using preferred pronouns, debates over identity that include things of those of you that took my class, for instance, on diversity. I talked a lot about, the new identities that we have to accommodate, that we have to come to terms with, and things like that, and how that's going. Cancel culture relates directly to the idea of the First Amendment. And if you don't know what cancel culture is, or you've heard the term and it's like, what does it really mean? In fact, there's even a debate on whether or not cancel culture really exists. Cancel culture is basically social censorship of what is in fact First Amendment protected speech. And so, going back to things that happened on Berkeley's campus after November 2016, we had, for instance, the so-called right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos come to campus to give a talk February 1st, 2017. It was a legally permitted speech. It was speech that was going to be protected by the First Amendment. In fact, his talk was going to be on the First Amendment. But the fact is, people on
Darren,
campus
can
thought,
I interrupt for 1 second?
yes, you can.
Or do you mean to only be on the first slide? Or do you mean to be
you're not.
clicking through the
So no,
slides?
I've been going through slides. So what's going on here? Hold on, everyone. Thank you for, let's see. Okay, I have a notice that says your screen sharing is paused. Why would it be paused? Let me
Can you go to
wait.
reshare?
Hold on.
Go in and out.
Okay, interesting. Okay, let me do that. Let me stand by for technical difficulties. I will stop and then I'll go right back. Let's see what's going on with that. That's very odd. Okay, share again. And you're not seeing anything yet. So it
Yeah,
says I'm screen sharing.
we see the We the People.
Now, do you see something?
Yeah, now it's clicking through.
Okay, there we go. I don't know what
Now
happened
we're
with
good.
that. I don't know why the screen sharing got paused. So as I'm talking and bring up to speed, I'll show you the slides I was showing. So this, when I was saying going from point A to point B, this was the images I was referring to there. So here's what I was talking about: cancel culture. So going back to Milo Yiannopoulos' talk, this idea that the First Amendment gives people that we don't want to hear the right to speak is what cancel culture stemmed from. The idea is it might be legally permissible speech, but not only do I not agree with it, I don't think it should be even heard. And what we have here is we have this tension in the First Amendment between what is legally defined as hate speech. Hate speech is the legal limit of First Amendment protected speech versus hate speech, which says you may have a right to say this, but I don't think you should be able to say it, and so I'm going to try to shut you down. So with Milo Yiannopoulos, for instance, not only was he shut down in the sense his speech was eventually canceled because of safety concerns, but then afterward people continued to protest so he would have his book deal taken away from him, which it eventually was. The publisher canceled the book deal and the money was going to be forwarded as an advance. That's kind of an example of cancel culture. And it's becoming increasingly common that this is a good approach. I'm very concerned about the pressure it's going to put if we confuse hate speech with hate speech. You know, we often think in terms of, yeah, I want to shut down these right-wing provocateurs, but don't forget, you know, if we go with hate speech as our standard versus hate speech, and if you don't know this, and I'm happy to clarify what this means, hate speech is an extraordinarily high legal burden of proof to basically decide the First Amendment doesn't protect it. You have to really go to a considerable extent of incitement to get to the point where the Supreme Court would not protect it. But we think of hate speech sometimes, we think of it from the point of view of, yeah, you know, let's shut down these right-wing QAnon folks, but it works both ways. If we decide that hate speech is going to be our barometer, you know, imagine, for instance, if I found a mug on Amazon yesterday, and the mug says, I hate that part of the morning when I wake up and realize Donald Trump is president. And you're like, yes, I'm going to bring that to work and put it on my desk. Well, suppose you have a fellow Republican in the office who says that mug hurts me, and then you're fired. That would be like, wait, what happened to the First Amendment? So it would go both ways. It would mean that people on the political right could easily shut down speakers of the left just by saying, I don't like what they're saying because it makes me feel bad. So this is something we really should be concerned about. In addition to the you know, what the First Amendment should be in the United States, don't forget the First Amendment also has this part of religion. And to remind everyone, I've said this in previous courses, but I always come back to it. We do not have, in the United States, we actually do not have the separation of church and state. That is not what the Constitution gives us. That is the French model. The French law on secularity, otherwise laïcité in French, says we separate church from state. But in the United States, what we have in the First Amendment is what's called the Non-Establishment Clause. We actually, it is perfectly legal. It is constitutionally protected in the United States to blend together religion and politics. The only thing we can't do is the United States cannot take any step to choose one religion as the official religion of the United States. And what's interesting is the courts have said in terms of choosing a specific religion, it has to be very specific. So having "In God We Trust" on the currency or on government buildings, as you see here, because it doesn't say "In the Catholic God We Trust" or the Protestant God or the Hebrew God or the Hindu God, it's considered perfectly acceptable because it does not represent the establishment of a specific religion. And I know atheists from time to time do try to, sue to have these things removed, and they always lose because, again, it is not a constitutional violation as long as it's not endorsing one specific religion over others. Which brings me to the other part, which is not in the First Amendment, but has basically become Supreme Court precedent, which is neutrality, which means as we treat one religion, we must treat all religions. So if we single out a specific religion for especially negative views or a special hostility, it creates problems. And you may remember when Trump initiated his what was called the Muslim travel ban, that would have violated the neutrality clause, but he did two things. He added in a few other countries that were not Muslim majority countries, and then called it a national security measure, which is how he kind of skirted the letter of the law on that. But in terms of past and current Supreme Court decisions, the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision, which you may remember, that was when the baker from Colorado who refused to bake a cake or make a wedding cake for same-sex marriage because he said it would violate his deeply held religious beliefs. The Supreme Court actually dodged the First Amendment part of this, whether or not the First Amendment protected religious practice up to and including the point where they could, in essence, violate federal discrimination law. The reason they could bypass that is because what they cited was the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and the Colorado local government and state government, they said, showed an extreme and distinct hatred of Christianity that they did not show to other religions. And so what swayed the justices in that case was the violation of Colorado in terms of the neutrality clause, that they showed a particular hatred for Christianity and for the head of Masterpiece Cake Shop, for the baker himself, that they had a hatred for him and his beliefs, which violated the neutrality clause. Currently on the Supreme Court docket, we have 303 Creative LLC versus Elenis, which is a similar case. I think this time it's going to be very interesting because it's a preemptive case in which a web design maker who's also a Christian has said she will design websites for persons of any sexual orientation, but she won't design them for weddings, same-sex weddings. And she said it's because it would violate, again, her deeply held religious beliefs. And because of the nature of the case, because it's preemptive, the Supreme Court is probably going to have to take pretty much head on the issue of whether or not the First Amendment would allow people to, in terms of religion, practice deeply held religious beliefs, even up to and including the extent that they may violate federal non-discrimination law. So it's going to be a very interesting case in terms of the First Amendment. How about the Constitution itself? You've probably heard, maybe less so in the past few years, but many of you may have heard that, the Constitution is in shreds. And I get where it comes from. I will, most of it came out of the Trump era, but, in terms of overuse of things like executive orders, which quite frankly is very concerning to me, that was not unique to the Trump administration. I know he liked using them because it gave him a tremendous sense of power, but, Obama before him started the trend and Biden seems to have continued that. But I have, many of you who've taken classes with me know that I'm by default an optimist. I never believe the Constitution in shreds. In fact, I personally think the Constitution has withstood very well almost everything thrown at it, and I'll continue that point in just a second. But I do have certain concerns about all three branches of government, and I'd like to see things moving in a kind of a reformist direction, including, for instance, let's start with the executive branch. Why am I concerned about executive orders? Because executive orders are ways of bypassing Congress. And the way the system is set up, at least constitutionally speaking, is that the executive branch is supposed to work with the legislative branch. The work of the executive branch to push things through is to try to reach some kind of consensus with Congress. And I have to say, if you were there for my debriefing after the midterm elections, I said, there's potentially kind of a good moment when both Republicans and Democrats might realize with the hard work that needs to be done, they might need to work together. Probably not completely harmonious bipartisanship, but at least a recognition that the rancor and enmity is not getting us anywhere better. So I was actually quite happy with Biden's comments at the State of the Union address that he seemed open and willing to do that. And maybe that will get us away from this precedent of issuing executive orders to get things done and more back to the way it's supposed to work according to constitutional design, where the executive branch works with Congress to try to find a way to, if not with complete consensus, to find a majority that agrees on a path forward. In terms of the legislative branch, the same comments hold true, that finding enough common ground where Republicans and Democrats can understand that there's a certain amount of frustration at the lack of activity or the lack of positive change. And that's going to require both parties to work together. I would also like to see the legislative branch kind of do what it's supposed to do and not fear passing legislation on controversial issues. They passed legislation regarding protections of same-sex marriage, largely because they said, and I think they were incorrect in doing so, they said they were protecting us from the Supreme Court. They were not doing that. They were simply doing what they should have done long ago, which was take the decision of Obergefell and turn it into a piece of legislation. The same would be the case if they can find the votes in terms of restoring the precedent of Roe v. Wade in terms of reproductive rights. That's the job of Congress, not necessarily the job of the judicial branch. And going back to the judicial branch, you've heard me say it before, if there are things I'm concerned about, I'm actually concerned about this growing mistrust and almost outright hatred of the judicial branch, mostly based upon, and this is in terms of everything I read, mostly based upon a complete lack of knowledge of what the judicial branch does, what the Supreme Court does, and its role in checks and balances. If we withdraw our trust from the judicial branch, if we weaken the judicial branch, it basically throws the checks and balances out of alignment in the same way that an overly powerful executive issuing nothing but executive orders does the same. So what we need here is a kind of, let's step back, let's remember how the government's supposed to work, and let's realign the three branches so the checks and balances are as strong as they need to be. Having said that, of course, there's the issue of January 6th. And you're thinking, how could an optimist have anything positive to say about January 6th? And I'm not going to say anything positive about January 6th itself. What I am going to say is that this effort to completely override the system, for me, actually showed how strong the integrity of the system is. At the end of the day, January 6th could never succeed. And I think that shows a system that is basically, that amazingly, for going back to the 18th century, was designed to withstand almost anything anyone could throw at it. Now, of course, there's also the lingering issue of incitement. And some of you, again, if you've been in class with me in the past, I think the issue of incitement, especially as it relates to whether or not there'll be definitive action against Donald Trump, my guess is probably no. And I know that will disappoint many of you, but the reason I say this is because right now, and I said this in my comments at the debriefing regarding the midterm elections, right now, the star of Trump seems to be naturally fading. Even his supporters, the numbers are kind of dwindling. Nothing would go as far as returning those followers or energizing his followers than giving him a huge mouthpiece, especially one that made him look like a victim. It's very, very difficult to succeed on the charge of incitement. It's possible to succeed on the idea of basically encouraging sedition, but it might just be more effective to basically do the thing that people can't seem to do, which is just turn off the microphone and let things kind of naturally fade and focus on the positive things and not that itself. Now, I know a lot of you will be disappointed hearing me say that, because there's this idea, I want to see him in handcuffs. I want to see him behind bars, but I think that would actually backfire in ways that would threaten the system even more. Happy to talk about it more as soon as I get through my comments here. Crime and punishment, another we the people issue that should be on everyone's mind, in the sense of, first of all, we can't even really agree on whether or not we have more crime or not. It's easy to completely bake statistics in any direction you really want. Some of you may have heard read the book, what is it called? I think Statistics, Lies, Damn Lies and Statistics, or something like that. Lies, Real Lies and Statistics. But to me, the fight over whether it shows there is more crime or less, or more violent crime or less, is less important than how people feel. And I am very, very curious to hear from all of you. So do feel free to just put your impressions in the chat so I can go back to them later. But, there's a growing chorus of people who simply say it can't continue, that it's the worst it's ever been, that people feel very unsafe. I got up and read the local news this morning, and there's catalytic converter thefts. There's another catalytic converter theft shooting in Oakland. This time they shot one of the thieves who was going away, but neighbors were saying, how unsafe is it that I have a shootout? Because when the owner of the car confronted him from the house, the thieves pulled out guns and shot at him. He pulled out a gun. It was in the middle of the night. He pulled out a gun and shot back at them, shot one of them, managed to hit one of them, who is now in the hospital. But there's this, people are saying, I have an 18-month, child in my home. What if, do I have to really worry about them being hit by stray bullets? Is that what we've become? Is it a Wild West mentality? So I think the feeling people have, and based upon all my conversations with neighbors and shop owners in the neighborhood, there's a real sense of that there's a lack of safety, that something has gone horribly wrong, and people want it fixed. It's interesting to live in a very liberal area like the Bay Area and have more and more people say things like, I just bought a gun, got to protect myself, which is not something you used to hear. It used to be, that's the wrong way to go. But now I'm hearing more and more people say that, which takes us into, of course, where are the police then? What would make us feel safer in terms of we the people? Well, all the police reforms that have been proposed, especially going back to what was supposed to be the moment of racial reckoning in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, almost all the police reforms have stalled. And that puts us in the situation where we can't arrive at police reform, but we can't go back to where it was either. There's also, and this just gets into the politics of a federal system, the federal government can only do so much in terms of police reform, because really what the federal government can do is only reform federal police. There's a lot of autonomy at the state and local level to make things better. And right now we can't even really agree on what those reforms would look like. Just like there's more and more people, at least, that I'm talking to, who are saying things like, I just bought a gun. We've gone from, here we have a sign that says, abolish the police. Let's get rid of the police altogether. There's more and more people, especially from Oakland, less so in Berkeley, but a lot of people in Oakland who are saying, not defund the police, but refund the police. Let's expand them and have them in every neighborhood. And again, it's that idea of, I feel so unsafe that that's what I want. It may not be, let's put police in every neighborhood the way it used to be, but it's like, let's find the money and let's have lots more police, because that's the way to go. So, from Joe Biden's perspective, the idea is, he also has said, I would like to expand police, but let's just expand the police, but have better enforcement methods. That kind of bumps up against, those not just in the Bay Area, but all over the country, who are saying, no, the answer is still fewer police, less enforcement, that basically what pushes crime is the violence of the police. And of course, this is very much back in the news because of what happened with the killing of Tyre Nichols. So, this has to go somewhere. We all know there's a problem, whether or not the statistics show it or not. People feel more vulnerable, and how are we going to reimagine the security of our communities, of our states, of our counties, and of course of the country in general? The answers are all kind of just bouncing about, but nothing seems to be getting done that is both concrete and constructive. This, of course, takes me to my last point here, which will take us into the question and answer part of today, which is, in terms of racial justice, aside from reforming policing, what are we going to do? What needs to be done to make the country feel whole again? The ongoing discussions about reparations are actually, by my reading, creating more division than unity. You probably all know that even San Francisco has said it's going to pursue its own reparations platform. People have said it can't, they can't afford it, that it's illegal. My guess is it will die in the courts anyway, which I'm happy to explain the reasons why I think both San Francisco's and almost any straightforward reparations program is probably going to fail in the courts. Lots of debates over affirmative action. As you know, with Prop 16 in the most recent election, everybody thought that was a no-brainer in the Bay Area. We would vote to bring affirmative action back after Prop 209. That in fact failed. People in the Bay Area decided that bringing back affirmative action and racial preferences was not a good idea. If you read the news at all, and I'm sure you all do, DEI, as in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and CRT in the form of critical race theory are, that battle is heating up, and it's going to take us directly into 2024. You're going to start hearing some folks say, we're going to have to implement it at the federal level. Others are saying it's nothing but tearing the country apart. As are ongoing debates about equity versus equality. Equality used to be the word where everybody gets the same thing. Now the idea is that giving everyone the same thing simply leaves inequality in place. And so equity means that those who need more should get more, and those who need less should get less. And that does kind of seem to run counter to some of the language in the Constitution itself, going back to the We the People theme. So this is also going to be something that we're going to have to sort out. What is the right way to go? Equity or equality or some blend thereof? So where does that leave us in the end in terms of, we the people? So let's go back to the phrase "we the people" and ask ourselves, how many of us feel that the phrase "we the people" includes we? How included do we feel in that right now? That's not a policy question. It's more of a question of, do you think there are more and more people who feel that the we and we the people does not represent them? Realigning the institutions, this would be, if somebody asked me where should we start, I would say we need to get the checks and balances are the heart of the whole thing. And if we keep hating on the institutions of governance, especially whether it's the Supreme Court or Congress, I had a great conversation with my undergraduate students this week, and they were actually surprisingly optimistic about the Supreme Court, but they had no faith at all in Congress. They just said Congress is useless. And it concerns me because that loss of legitimacy in institutions creates a weakness in understanding how the three branches of government, the checks and balances kind of interweaves them. And that's the essence of the strength of the Constitution. So part of that is the fact that because of popular sovereignty, we give legitimacy or withhold legitimacy, and that's how we hold the government accountable. So I'd like to see the three branches of government kind of regaining the trust of people, not because they have to pander to it, but because we need to understand why our trust is an important part of the process. Administrative reform at every level, starting with the localities, right here in Berkeley, for instance. Many of you may know I'm teaching a brand new class this semester, which is it's called Political Discourse in the 21st Century, which was also an OLLI class, but I'm doing it at the undergraduate level. At the undergraduate level, part of their assignment is they have to get involved in local politics, and they're very excited about it. And I've got a couple folks who are already getting really worked up about all the bike lane debates here in Berkeley, and so it's really fun to talk to them. And lastly, again, some of you may have heard me talk about this, especially if you've been in my classes. I've kind of coined a new term. I'm sure you've all heard of microaggressions. I'm also concerned about what I call micro-transgressions. And what I mean by this is, that sense of security isn't just about crime. It's also about this, egregious lack of empathy and togetherness that occurs in the way we interact. And the thing I've come to really monitor is how people are driving. I mean, last night, coming home from campus, near the last intersection I have to cross and getting home has one of those pedestrian crosswalks where you push the button and it basically is the double red light. It was dark. I actually have lights on, and I started crossing, and someone just blew through the double red lights, would have clearly hit me. I've learned that you can't trust pedestrian crosswalks. And it was sad because as he blew by me with no concern for whether, I mean, we're talking maybe 2 feet away from me. I stopped because I realized he wasn't going to stop. He had his family in the car. It wasn't just one angry guy. It was like you could see children in the back seat, and there was a family in the car, and he was like, it's like, it just felt so wrong. But it was just the complete disregard. Like, there's a double red light. The law, I don't care what the law says. I don't care about pedestrians. It's all about what I want. And if I want to blow through red lights and stop signs, transgress the law. Micro transgressions, the cumulative effect of people doing that over and over again, and more people doing it, to me, is every bit as damaging as worrying about the Constitution being in shreds. So there you have it for my We the People introduction to all the things that matter. I would love to hear from you. We're about halfway through. I'd love to hear from you and see what questions and insights you have, especially, as I said, I'd love to hear from you whether you feel things are less safe right now. I've been talking to a lot of people, and I'd love to hear from you whether or not that you're thinking, yeah, I don't feel safe anymore, or that you feel things haven't changed, whatever. So let me go over to the chat section and see what's going on. I figured the first ones would be about the glitch. I really have no idea what happened with that. So here we go. First question comes from Bruce. Is hate speech essentially the same as shouting fire in a crowded theater? Yes, although the shouting fire in a crowded theater thing is really about inciting people to engage in harmful action. But the shouting fire in a crowded theater, which comes from, again, a Supreme Court decision, there are 3 central cases to understanding what the legal burden of proof is for hate speech, and that burden is very, very high. Turns out you can yell fire in a crowded theater. You could probably get away with it unless you could prove in a court of law that your intention was to get people to harm each other. Now, if there was actually a fire, of course, that nullifies that. But if you just yelled fire in a crowded theater you'd have to prove the intent to harm. That turns out to be very difficult. The actual barometer for hate speech is actually linked directly to incitement. And that barometer is that you have to engage in speech that any reasonable person, upon hearing your speech, would be incited to engage, and here's the key phrase, in imminent lawless action intended to harm. And that's very difficult to prove. One of the central cases actually involves a Black business owner who was organizing a boycott of white businesses, basically a Black business boycott of white businesses, who said any Black business owner who does not join my boycott, that we should kill them. He basically said, we can kill them. And even that didn't meet the burden of proof of hate speech, because they said it was just a general wish that someone should be killed. Imminent lawless action means that there has to be a very specific threat that reasonable people would act upon. So shouting fire in a crowded theater, even, if everybody basically left the theater in an orderly manner, or there was no harm or intent to harm, would actually still be protected by the First Amendment. Keep going here. Let's see, here we go. First and 14th Amendment. Some legal scholars have suggested religion-connected lawsuits are moving from free exercise against abortion and things to equal protection under 14th Amendment. What does the town hall think of this? I'll see if there's any other comments. The problem with moving to the 14th Amendment is the 14th Amendment is like the laundry list amendment. People see in the 14th Amendment a lot of things that they just want to see there. There's a reason, for instance, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself had said that she agrees with the outcome of Roe v. Wade. She said, I really wish they wouldn't have gone to the 14th Amendment because it's just the kind of thing that's easy. It's easy to see things in it, but that means it's also easy to undo them. Clarence Thomas, for instance, has never hidden his disdain for people overusing the 14th Amendment. So I understand why people are going there, but I have a feeling, especially the current Supreme Court, is going to drag it back to the First Amendment. Keep going. Here we have in Hinduism, there are many gods. So stating in God, you are negating their religion. Not necessarily. It's interesting because there are different interpretations of Hinduism. For instance, in Indonesia, by law, you have to be a practitioner of a monotheistic religion, and they include Hinduism. And Hindus, both in India and Indonesia, argue that you don't have many gods, you have many manifestations of one divine essence, that Shiva and Ganesha, for instance, are actually different manifestations of what is in fact one divine essence. Or you could simply say that you're specifying, if you say, I think the way I said it is, I said a Hindu god. So if you said, Shiva or they're Vishnu. So, it would be interesting, but there's no disagreement that in fact that is not some kind of divinity, which means God might cover it. We'll see. Can you comment on the lawsuit by the attorneys in Missouri, Louisiana against Biden administration officials who urged Facebook to take down accounts of anti-vaxxers, free speech versus disinformation? I can comment on this, and this gets us into the idea of the history of free speech, because the United States in many ways is a free speech, I don't want to say absolutist country, because absolutism means anything goes. But historically, the Supreme Court in the United States has been very reluctant to remove even incorrect information. Now, if you're confused about the difference between misinformation and disinformation, the difference between the two is intent. That misinformation is incorrect information that you're passing on, that you are not aware is incorrect information, or just are passing it on thinking it was true. Disinformation has the element of intent, which means you are intentionally passing on incorrect information designed to either confuse people or to get them to take a wrong course of action. And even disinformation has been protected by the First Amendment. The social media platforms have relentlessly lobbied the government not to start, censoring them in terms of the First Amendment. Now they're doing so less because they're free speech absolutist, and more because it will harm their platforms and the revenue generation streams, because the revenue generated by social media comes in basically by keeping people on the platform. If you ban disinformation, or even you ban, say, anti-vaxxers, they'll go elsewhere. They'll invent another platform, or they'll go to what's called the dark web, which is you need a special router to find the dark web. So social media platforms are saying, we'll do our best, we'll keep an eye on it, but the First Amendment protects all of this. And the history of free speech actually shows that. Even going back to John Stuart Mill, in his essay on liberty, was very clear that you should allow all information, including lies, to circulate, because only by exposing ourselves to everything can we ultimately and collectively find the truth. So my guess is that these lawsuits are going to bump up against the First Amendment, and if they make it to even higher courts, if not even the Supreme Court, that they will be very reluctant to try to set a precedent for disinformation, because what will happen is people will misuse it. They'll say, on the campaign trail, that my opponent said bad things about me, it's disinformation, I'd like it banned. And nobody wants that to happen. So that's why I suspect that they're unlikely to step in, and because you can't, disinformation is like obscenity. You might know it when you see it, but actually defining it in specific legal terms is almost impossible. So someone's saying, are you familiar with Bill Sokol's classes on the Supreme Court? I certainly am. And I think a lot of other people are too. And this is, I don't want to step on his toes, but I know he does stuff on the Supreme Court. I've never sat in on his lecture. I've just chatted with him, and I did an event with him once for Ollie. So Let's see, has the rapid growth of administrative agencies in the last 100 years allowed the elected branches to avoid responsibility for unpopular policies and forced the judiciary into a position which the founders never intended? I'm not sure the rapid growth of administrative agencies is singularly responsible for that. I think the growth of administrative agencies is certainly responsible for the ineffectiveness of government. We have this at the university level. Almost all universities are facing the problem of administrative bloat, which makes them totally inefficient. But I would say one of the problems is whether it's because of the rapid growth of administration, there is certainly this belief, and I think it's I think it's accurate, that a lot of things have been passed off the judicial branch that should have been done by Congress, and it's especially because of unpopular or controversial policies like abortion. I mean, there was nothing that would have prevented Congress from passing a law, with a federal right for abortion, because everyone knew. And those of you, again, if you've been in my classes, you've probably heard me talk about this. Everyone has known since 1973 that the Roe precedent was a very, very weak precedent. It was not. It was never going to stand the test of time. It's in many ways, it's surprising it lasted as long as it did. But there was a quick fix to it. There was an easy fix, which was to pass federal legislation that would take it out of the hands of the judicial branch. And that never happened because abortion is a controversial policy, and many politicians don't want to get involved with talking about abortion. That may change now because of the Dobbs decision, but so far we don't see, any real work in that direction. So let's see, keep going here. I'm concerned about our judicial branch. I don't know what kind of concern you have. All federal judges except Supreme Court are subject to a code of conduct. Yes, I think a lot of people are concerned about the judicial branch. I'm less concerned. I'm more concerned about the lack of trust in the judiciary, because I think it ultimately undermines the integrity of the checks and balances system itself. In another lecture, in a much longer lecture in a different class, I talked about how moving towards the ability, civility requires us to say, I disagree with the court's decision, but I respect the institution itself. And that is, my whole class on civility was devoted to getting to that point. If you didn't take that, again, sorry, but that was 4 weeks on civility, and maybe I can talk about it a bit later or in a future class. Jackie's posted a link to the article on free speech versus disinformation. Thanks for that. Keep going here. Let's see. Somebody saying, look at the book, Why Nations Fail. Yes, I've read it. And thank you for saying it supports my viewpoint. That's good. And so excellent. I've read the book. In fact, I've assigned a chapter from it in one of my classes this semester. It's human nature to focus on negative things. Then why am I an optimist? Why do I always want to be positive? I guess I'm less human than others. Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. Yes, that's the title of the book. I think I couldn't quite find it. Naturally fade, Bolsonaro is now running in the Trump MAGA rallies, stoking more disinformation and hate. Yes, but it didn't work. And now, in the US system, as I said, Trump in the US versus Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is trying to do the Trump thing. There are other populist politicians. There's, Viktor Orban in Hungary. But in the US in particular, after the midterm elections, many of you who went to the elections event, my debriefing, know that I was in Ohio during the elections, and I was, there was so much less of a Trump presence in Ohio than there was just a few years before, and that's unrelated to what's happening in Brazil. I know Bolsonaro tried to do a January 6th; it also failed. Brazil's politics are much less stable. The system has far less integrity, but at least here in the United States, I think. For what it's worth, one of the problems with me of what happened in leading into November 2016 is that, going back to the adage, any publicity is good publicity. Everybody could not stop talking about Donald Trump. And it always made him look like he was the most important person in the election room. And that actually, I think, helped him. And so the idea of giving free publicity may not be the best way to go forward, was what I was getting at there. Are you really saying that facts don't matter? No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply saying that we have to take into account how people actually feel. A lot of people feel very scared right now, and they may vote on how they feel. Again, if you took the most recent class with me on political discourse, in my own neighborhood, we're trying to get together kind of a neighborhood watch program because people are saying, crime is just rampant. We have, porch pirates. Every day somebody's saying my Ring camera caught somebody stealing all my packages, things like this. And we have a couple of neighbors who were like, it's all an illusion. It's not really happening. It's just Republican propaganda. But people often vote on how they feel. And I have provided statistics to neighbors saying, look, here are the crime rates in our neighborhood, and they have certainly gone up. So I have shown them facts, I have shown them numbers, and they're just like, don't want to see it, don't care, it's all propaganda, don't buy into what the Republicans are saying. So I'm not saying that facts don't matter, I'm saying they do matter, but I'm also saying people are often not swayed by them. They go by how they feel, and if they feel more vulnerable, and if they feel less safe, they're going to do things, as irrational as it might seem, like buy guns to protect themselves. And that used to be, that's not something I remember, neighbors and other Berkeleyans saying, like I finally bought a gun because I feel so unsafe. That's new for me. And I've lived here for at least a little while. Police forces in most cities have been steadily hollowed out. It's sad what is going on with Oakland's police chief. Yeah, that's that was already a bad situation. That didn't help. And yes, it's like, the people who live in areas where there's a lot of shooting perpetrated by gangs want more police. Yes, this is becoming common, especially with folks that I know in Oakland. Like enough, we just want more police. Biden's trying to sell the idea of more but better police, but there's only so much you can do at the federal level, not much at the local level. Now, hollowing out the police forces, it's interesting. I talked to some friends in Texas who have said they see an intentional policy here of police departments wanting things to actually get worse to show what happens if you defund the police. That basically, it's like they're saying, okay, if you want that, then you'll get that. And at some point, everyone's going to say, we're so sorry, let's bring all the police back. That police are basically, departments are being hollowed out intentionally. The police forces actually want that because it's like, you'll miss us when we're gone kind of thing. There was a couple retired law enforcement people saying that they think it's actually a strategy they're trying to use to put pressure on people, that rising crime rates are exactly what they want, so they can show people, if you want us to fix it, we want bigger salaries, we want more police, and let us do our job kind of thing. It's a very interesting but also troubling national discussion we're having about these things. Let's see, keep going here. Are there other countries with systems where the police protect everyone equally? Are there perfect systems? No, but what there are is there are places that get things right. I'll give you an example. I mean, I had a really interesting discussion with one of my undergraduate students who's an exchange student from Spain. She was in office hours yesterday, and we were talking about homelessness. And she said, I was completely shocked when I came to Berkeley. This is her first semester. She's only here for one semester, actually. And she said, I'm completely shocked by the homeless people. Like walking by People's Park, I was like, America to me was Hollywood and all the things I saw. And then I saw, all these homeless tents. And she was just like, what's going on here? And then she said, we do have homelessness in Barcelona, where she's from. She said, there's a huge difference. She said, the homeless persons in Barcelona are not, for instance, the ones who are suffering from, cognitive disabilities, or what we sometimes call mental illness. And she said, the reason is because we actually have healthcare that includes mental health, and everyone has free access to it. So she said there's drugs, but even that is considered to be something that is publicly funded. Whereas here, very few health insurance plans fund mental health, and those who need it most probably don't have good health insurance anyway. And so she was saying, we both have homelessness, but she said, for America being the wealthiest country in the world, I'm shocked at how, at the different nature of homelessness, even right here in Berkeley. So, I kind of agree with the idea of more police, but having to completely reimagine what the police are supposed to do, and pushing that into other directions, like maybe rethinking healthcare once again. We never seem to get that right, so that mental health is seen as just as important. Sweden and many of the Nordic countries, for instance, have what are called mental health police. They have ambulances that just go and check on people, and they have trained psychologists, and they just they intervene in systems. So convincing people in the United States that's a good idea might be a good way to go, but it's an uphill battle to sell that idea here. Let's see. So many people in the red states don't feel they are included in that we. Correct. I mean, and that was, did an event, also another town hall here not that long ago with Arlie Hochschild. And, that's been kind of her ongoing work, is that we need to find a way to get more people to come back to the idea that that we the people does include all of us. And I kind of agree with her on that. I liked her book, and I like the way she talks, and she has kind of a Zen calmness about her that's like, reminds me of kind of where civility can take us. Let's see. Someone's saying, ever since you mentioned our lawlessness and stop signs, I've been way more careful. Hey, thank you. Yay. All the people behind me are not happy. Yes. I mean, you feel that pressure. Everybody seems to think that stop signs are like interesting red decorations that somebody put up all over the city. But thank you for, thanks for that. I appreciate the comment and the fact that, it resonated. Yay. Someone's saying there's more crime in Oakland than OPD is reporting. Yeah, underreporting of crimes is also a huge issue. And I have a personal anecdote to that I've shared in my classes, which is, I've had my catalytic converter stolen twice. The first time I had to file a police report that had to go to the insurance. They asked for a report with the insurance. Second time around, the police didn't even, I called the police and they said, don't even bother with it. There's too many of them. We'd prefer not to take a report, and your insurance company won't ask for it anyway. So it was never reported. I never filed a report, and the insurance company said, it's just so common, we'll just take your word for it. So that's a classic case of underreporting so many things, because we know it's happening, but it's happening so much the police are basically stopping taking reports and things like that. Yes, more people commenting on the traffic. Let's see, someone saying in Berkeley, nothing's being done about homeless encampments. Nothing is done. Where does the law come in? This is part of, the local fight for things. Can anyone do anything in Berkeley? We have homeless advocates who are saying, don't push people out. It's not against the law to be homeless. The criminalizing homelessness is kind of structural violence. We have that discussion versus those who are saying, I don't want it in my neighborhood. I've got children. There's needles in the playgrounds and things like this. And it's a conversation that doesn't go anywhere. It kind of goes into this endless loop. Even when you do something like, as San Francisco has done with their, homes first, where they're putting people in hotels, you have people saying, I'd like a free vacation in a hotel. Can I just go to a hotel and get free room and board? Because my rent is very expensive. And so it's a conversation that, especially in historically liberal areas, is very difficult to find consensus on. Let's see. Keep going here. Can you speak to restorative justice? Restorative justice is it's interesting. Restorative justice in the United States, for some reason, has always been a hard sell, and I can list some of the reasons. In the U.S., so many people, whether for religious belief in the law of retaliation, or this idea of, put them in a cell, lock them up, throw away the key, is a very American phrase. You don't hear that in so many other places. There are places, of course, where the police are hopelessly corrupt, and that gets into a whole different thing. But restorative justice, the idea of when people go to prison for a crime, that the role of criminal justice is to give them a chance to be a better person, as opposed to give them a chance to put them in such a miserable situation that they'll never do it again, which is punitive justice. You get a lot of this pushback for the same reason that I talked about with, don't criminalize the homeless, let them be. The idea is, if we're too nice to criminals, it's like, what about the victims? You often hear there's a whole victims justice thing. If somebody is in jail for a violent robbery, why would I want to train them to be a chef which by the way is a skill you can learn in a Norwegian prison. What about the victim? Let's give the help to the victim and let the criminals rot and rue their mistakes, kind of thing. It's a very tough sell. We'd have to really re-engineer the way Americans look at criminal justice. And I know there are a lot of people working on that, but they'll all tell you the same thing, that it's an uphill sell. And going back to the idea of neighbors who have bought guns in Berkeley, I'm hearing more and more, again, it's a very liberal area, and restorative justice actually has deep resonance in places like Berkeley. But I'm hearing more and more people getting very frustrated at no cash bail policies, at the catch and release policies, who are saying, find these catalytic converter thieves and throw them in jail for like 10 years. And so, just get them off the streets, kind of thing. And so it's that sense, that feeling of a lack of security, a lack of control, is pushing more people back into the punitive justice area as opposed to restorative justice. I think the right combination of both is a better way to go, but it's more than just passing legislation. It's about really hitting the road and convincing other Americans that that's a worthwhile investment. I think it's possible, but it's a very difficult struggle. There seems to be so much hate. Yes, I've talked a lot about that, and this idea that the other side is evil. So I did a whole class on civility, and it's also why I hope President Biden follows through on his idea that maybe it's time to work together on things, that if people see that happening, it's kind of like learning by example. That if other people are doing it, if Congress can do it, maybe the rest of us can do it, kind of thing. Running out of time, got a few minutes left here though. Did I say, yeah, someone's saying to get to the dark web, you need a special browser, not router. If I said router, sorry, misspoke. That, yeah, definitely, you need a special, it's actually called an onion router, but it's actually a special browser. So yes, Tor is abbreviation for the onion router, but it is a browser. So thanks for that clarification. Is increasing congestion and population increase contributing to microtransgressions? It's a great question, because you could argue it should go the other way, that the more people are here, the closer we are to each other, which means we have a stronger social glue. And you could argue that sparse populations mean people feel they won't be seen or they won't be caught. So it might be part of it, but I think there's just really the sense of kind of latent hostility, and that in many ways, I don't think the Constitution has been shredded, but I do think the social fabric, even right here in Berkeley, I just have the strong feeling that the social fabric that is, civic glue has definitely come unstuck or unraveled. And rebuilding that is something we need to work on, even one neighborhood at a time. I'm a little concerned, quite frankly. I know I'm not going to be a NIMBY here, but we are building lots and lots of new housing, which, hooray if it does bring rents down or helps with the housing problem. But having a lot of new people suddenly show up in a community can put a lot of pressure on the already frayed social fabric. So we'll see where that goes. Many minorities and Black folk feel they're not part of the we. Yes, agreed. How can we address this effectively? That's a great question. I have sometimes called for this idea that, in my civility class, I describe civility as the rules that we create them and then we abide by them. And the problem is that many of the rules of civility were created not by everyone, but by some people, but we expect everyone to, follow them. And so maybe it's time for a new social contract. Maybe it's time for this idea that we need to revisit the rules of civility when we rebuild the social fabric or we strengthen the civic glue, and invite everyone to that conversation so they feel like they contributed to this rule book we call civility. That would be one way to go. Let's see. 1 minute left. Let me just do a quick. I'm almost through all the questions. I almost got there. Let me see if I can get to something. Restorative justices in schools. Thank you. Some of these are comments, not questions. And they're kind of agreeing with what I was just saying. Yay. So let me do one more question here. And that would be, here's a positive comment. Someone's saying 6 decades in Texas, and kids, there were so many guns, kids accidentally shot each other. I feel safer here in Berkeley. So thank you for that. I didn't want to make it sound like, I don't want to try to verify the reality. I know people are feeling less safe, but they're feeling less safe because they're long-term Berkeley residents. But it's nice to be able to end on someone saying that you feel safer here in Berkeley than you did elsewhere. I lived for a time in Texas. I went to high school in Texas, and I distinctly remember people driving around in pickup trucks. Gun racks were legal. I don't know if they still are, but you would have like 3 rifles in your pickup truck as you drove around. And even then in high school, I was like, this is kind of messed up that just people driving around with guns everywhere. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's nice to end on a more positive note that not everyone feels that everything's falling apart, and that at least one person feels safer, and many of you might feel safer. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. Before I wrap things up here, I do want to ask if Susan, if you have any final comments or wrap up things you might want to say here.
Darren, what I want to say is a big, huge appreciation for not only how you frame the discussion, but also the wealth of information and perspective that you're sharing. I think that for those who did ask a question, what we will do is we will give a copy of these questions after I've sort of aggregated them into particular areas, so that when we meet in May and bring a variety of others forward, though it's hard to imagine anyone doing as great a job as you, Darren, to talk about what will continue to be the questions underlying our unity, and thinking even more proactively about what we need to do as activists, as citizens, et cetera. And so Darren, I'd like to end today with a big thank you to you and to all of the OLLI members who came in today to listen. I think that this is a great way for us to start our year, continue our year in discussion and dialogue with each other. So I hope everybody has a great weekend, especially you, Darren.
Thank you.
And I just want to remind people, we start registrations for the spring term. Hopefully everybody's received a copy of your brochure. We start those registrations on Monday morning. So thank you for being here today, and we'll see you back in the classroom on Monday. Bye-bye.
All right.